Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios of the National Press Foundation in Washington, D.C. My name is Rachel Jones, and I'm the Director of Journalism Initiatives with NPF. Thank you for joining us for day one of the 2023 Covering Rare Diseases Journalism Fellowship. Over the next 5 days, 25 journalists from around the world will receive high-level briefings from leading researchers, academics, and advocates who will provide the data, context, and insights needed to educate the public about rare diseases. But before we get started, we would like to thank our sponsor, Foundation Ipsen, for their ongoing support of the NPF Covering Rare Diseases program. For the past few years, Foundation Ipsen has also compiled and published the stories and projects produced by NPF Fellows in 2021 and 2022. And you can read those stories by visiting our website at nationalpress.org. For our first session, it's often said that knowledge is power. And those words are especially true for families and patients who are dealing with rare disease. In an age where access to information is plentiful for people who have education and resources, even the most well-off people face daunting barriers to diagnoses, to treatments, and pathways to advocacy. Those challenges increase exponentially for lower income communities and communities of color who are often invisible in research and advocacy circles. But increasingly, institutions like the National Institutes of Health are acknowledging the need to make data and health information more readily available. Our first speaker, Dr. Eric Sid, is a program director in the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences Division of Rare Disease Research Innovation, where he is the lead for the Genetic and Rare Diseases Information Center, or GARD. GARD provides free, comprehensive, plain language information on rare and genetic diseases to the public and is accessible through both their website and contact center. Dr. Sid is also the lead for the Rare Diseases Registry, or RADAR program, which offers guidance for establishing and maintaining patient registries. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Sid. Please take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm a fast talker, so I'm just going to start by saying if you have questions or if you need me to repeat anything, please don't hesitate to ask. I'll try to keep an eye out for the chat, but it's a little difficult to see this on Zoom, so feel free to raise your hand. I will be able to see that on my monitor. As I go through, please feel free to ask questions. I can definitely have no problems with stopping and answering them, as well as I'll definitely set aside some time at the end for this as well. So before I get started heavily in this topic, I wanted to begin by saying, when we talk about rare diseases really capture human stories. They talk about our fears, our tragedies, our hopes and resilience. And if there's anything that I would want you to walk away with from this presentation today, is really that your role as journalists is really being able to capture and pen those stories. Many of you probably have a personal connection with rare diseases that might have brought you to this. Many of you have probably heard about rare diseases. That's definitely true of myself. I was thinking about this at a talk I recently gave with the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. And when I think of rare diseases, I've actually had to play multiple different roles, both as a patient myself, as a family, advocates, community leaders, healthcare providers, and as researchers. All are different members that are really crucial to the process of talking about rare disease research. When we talk about this issue as a whole, we talk about the public health challenges that come with rare diseases. There are over 10,000 different rare diseases. Only 5% of these have treatments or cures. The time it takes for early development for a drug can be between 10 to 15 years. And oftentimes, many of those will fail. 9 out of 10 therapeutic candidates fail when they enter clinical trials. Now, in trying to understand this issue as a whole, I just want to give a little bit of background to this, and I'll explain some of these different numbers. So what are we talking about when we are talking about rare diseases? A rare disease is a legislative definition. It's a congressional term in the US. It was defined by the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, and it was designed to incentivize the development of new drugs to treat rare diseases, in defining them as any disease or condition that affects less than 200,000 people in the US. Now, as a legislative definition, this means that there are different definitions for rare diseases depending on the country you're from. In the US, we use an absolute prevalence number, less than 200,000. Japan uses less than 50,000, South Korea less than 20. Others will use rates. In the EU and the European Union, they use less than 1 in 2,000. In Australia, it's less than 1 in 20,000. Oftentimes, each nation has its own different, unique definition. When we talk about what's included in rare diseases, there's a lot of different definitions of what can be included. In general, over 10,000 different types of unique rare diseases have been identified across different data sets. But again, this is different depending on who you talk to and what you're looking at within different countries. When we talk about the diseases that are rare, they're oftentimes described as very heterogeneous or quite distinct in their different presentations. Many of them, over 80%, are often thought to be genetic in origin. A number of them, 45%, are primarily neurologic. They affect your brain and nervous system. A large number of them oftentimes are related to developmental defects or issues that you might see in development as a child grows. Many of them involve cancers, many of them affect the eye, and they affect many other systems. There's everything from rare intoxications or toxicities to types of genetic diseases to cancers to immune disorders. You name it, there's a rare disease that probably encapsulates that. So this is a really broad group of diseases. One thing to note is that the majority of rare diseases have an actually extremely small population that they affect. So even though there are thought to be over 10,000 different rare diseases, the majority of them likely affect less than 1 in a million. In the US, out of 330 million, that would mean that it's less than 300 or so. So what this means is that when we talk about thousands of diseases, and oftentimes affecting collectively a large percent of the population, anywhere between 4 to 10% have been estimates that have been provided. So that can be millions of Americans that are affected with a rare disease. But again, each of these individual diseases may be extremely rare. This means that we need scalable solutions that can be applied across thousands of different diseases. And otherwise, we're not going to get anything forward in terms of treatment and research development. So again, individually, rare diseases are rare. Collectively, when taken together as an aggregate, they're common. Oftentimes, when we talk about stories about rare diseases, for example, I typed in a Google search for stiff person syndrome. Many of you may have heard about that recently, and you can see on the left-hand side of your screen a number of different search engine results showing news articles related to stiff person syndrome. We see a lot around Celine Dion and her recent diagnosis for that earlier this year, but you still see other articles about individuals. That second link you see, exclusive Florida woman reveals how car crash triggered her stiff person syndrome. There's oftentimes a trigger for interest amongst the public around rare diseases, many times around individuals affected by it. This could be families that have stories that you will write and again, kind of generate attention towards, or those that affect celebrities or other well-known individuals. What you see on the right-hand side is a Google trend that just shows the number of different searches for stiff person syndrome, again, as an example. And then what you find is that a lot of the interest in it really grew after Celine Dion's diagnosis. So I wanted to kind of point to this because oftentimes this is one where we see a lot of equity issues, is that many rare diseases exist, thousands, but the individual diseases that get the most attention are often those that are related to someone that's famous or, again, well-known. I wanted to point to this one example. Within Friedreich's ataxia, one of the leaders within that space that founded a patient group known as FARA, Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, has been trying to basically spend his entire life fighting for a treatment for his disease. His son was diagnosed at 11, passed away at 24. This is an image of Ron Bartek, and the image on the right-hand side was actually recently, after decades of fighting for research efforts within this disease, their space finally saw a new treatment approved by the FDA this past year. So for many individuals and in their families, rare diseases are a struggle and a story that really surrounds their entire life, encapsulates it in many ways. This is an issue for us at NCATS. When we talk about our vision of what we're trying to do as an organization, as a Center for Translational Science at the National Institutes of Health, our focus is on trying to develop more treatments for all people more quickly. And again, going back to that issue about rare diseases, as I'd mentioned earlier, many of rare diseases, majority of them, are likely genetic in their origin. Every year, we learn more and more about the understandings of human genetics, and we unravel more of an understanding of these different diseases. Each year, we understand what the cause or known molecular basis for a disease might be for hundreds of diseases each year. But the rate that we see treatments develop is still really not catching up to that. Even though we understand, again, hundreds of different new diseases every year in terms of their genetic cause, we only have treatments for less than 5% of rare diseases. Much of this has to do with the complexity of research process itself. This is a map just to show you all of the different steps required in getting from research to an approved therapy. Over years, what we've seen is that the rate of discovery between rare diseases, so in terms of publications, journal articles, and actual approved drugs, is continuing to widen. So here you see over time, the last 40 years, publications per rare disease against the number of approvals that we've seen both in the FDA as well as the EMA in the EU. Much of this goes back to the time and cost it takes to approve a treatment. For a single drug for a disease, it can take up to 10 to 15 years on average, going through thousands of potential compounds, ultimately into billions of dollars spent in clinical trials to see one approved therapy. Part of the reason that rare diseases as an issue exists has to go back to that defining legislature, which is really around trying to get innovation and inspire investment in treatments toward rare diseases. This is a translational science problem. This is the reason why, as a center, we talk about rare diseases. The issue in common amongst rare diseases is this lack of therapeutic development. It's something that extends to any disease that has an extremely low prevalence rate or population. So for us, part of the solution is to understand really what's similar across diseases, because if we want to address 10,000 plus diseases and trying to figure out treatments, we can't do this one disease at a time. We have to think about what's similar across multiple diseases and try to develop multiple treatments at a time. We need to look into models that better predict a person's reaction to a treatment so we can make sure that what we're giving them ultimately is able to progress their health. And similarly, we have to design and conduct trials that accurately represent the patient populations that we have today. So at NCATS, what we try to do is our goal is really to tackle ongoing challenges in translational research so that we can make new treatments reach people faster. And part of that is involving the entire translation pipeline. When we talk about translation, we're talking about moving from different stages of research, from bench where you're at maybe the microscope and looking at cell lines, to then getting a treatment, to then seeing that in clinic. How do we address the bottlenecks that prevent research from progressing towards clinic and ultimately for you as if you were a rare disease patient to have access to something? We have to ask ourselves, what are the issues that prevent research from moving forward for many rare diseases as a collective? Oftentimes it's because the traditional one-size-fits-all approach to research doesn't really work that well in rare diseases. You may have a small patient population. Again, imagine that you have a child with a rare disease, less than 20 people in the US that have it. There's not much of a business case for pharmaceutical industry to come in and create a therapy for your child and for others affected by this. Similarly, because they're oftentimes not that well known and well understood, a shortage of researchers leads to a gap in terms of our current understanding for many rare diseases. We can't solve this one disease at a time. We need to think about platforms. We need to think about how we can enhance and expand maybe use of current drugs and therapeutics. And we have to be thinking about team science as a whole. Who's involved in this when we talk about research? So within the NIH, NCATS oftentimes is a home for rare diseases. When we try to understand how to treat and bring treatments to rare diseases, we're thinking about both resources to educate, empower, and provide resources to the rare disease community. We're often thinking about our funding for medical research, as well as ways that we can drive data-driven solutions to shorten issues that we might see in rare diseases. And I wanted to emphasize that this is an org chart of my center. I'm, again, a part of the Division of Rare Diseases Research Innovation, but all of the other center divisions and offices you see in red often will have efforts extending into rare diseases as well. Many of the other ones will even have projects, even the ones in blue. So it's not something that's just focal to my division alone. I mentioned this earlier, much of what our focus on with rare diseases is really thinking about what's similar across multiple rare diseases at a time. And what we need to really be thinking about is ways to leverage resources that are available to us. Data science as a good example. So I wanted to give one example of this just to help you understand a little bit better what's involved in therapy development with a rare disease. So Jansen's metaphyseal chondrodysplasia, or JMC, is a disease that's being studied at Mass Gen, and it's extremely rare. 25 cases known in the world. It's a disease of bone development. You can see some pictures here on the top right that show you a little bit of the effects of this disorder. It's known to be caused by a genetic mutation or variant in the PTH receptor type 1. And there are currently no effective treatments, though we are in the process of trials for some therapies. How do you do drug development for a disease that affects, again, less than 25 people in the world? This involves key partnerships between patients and patient communities, researchers, clinical sites, and government partners to really facilitate this. We can't do this with individuals alone. We have to do this as a collaborative, as a network. As a process, everything starts and ends with patients. So what we have to do is heavily involve patient advocates in the collaboration process. If there's only 25 patients in the world that have this, every individual patient participating in a clinical trial is really important. This is not as much of an issue when you talk about a disease like diabetes, which affects millions. You don't need necessarily every patient involved, but 25. That requires a heavy integration of the community. It requires us to think about how we would include different testing at different stages, preclinical, the work that folks in the lab are doing with mouse models or cell lines or other types of animal models, the work that we're doing within the pharmaceutical space around drug candidates, as well as clinical researchers working in trials. Ultimately, all of this has to go together into then thinking about how we would create a treatment that can hopefully benefit children with improved life. So at NCATS, there's a progression in rare diseases really requires an engagement at all stages of research. Oftentimes, folks will focus on the individual work that a researcher might do, either with looking over compounds and trying to get collaborations and research, getting patents, but networks are key. Really involving all different groups of partners and stakeholders ultimately is how we've been able to be successful in our work in terms of facilitating new drug applications or investigational drugs within the rare diseases space. Now, bringing it back to the patient and the stories that you're going to hear. Many rare disease patients will face common obstacles. So I mentioned earlier, individually, rare diseases are rare. Collectively, they face common issues, and collectively, they're quite common. As an example for this, mitochondrial diseases are a class of rare diseases. One of the things I wanted to pull in was this Sansky diagram on the left that just shows as who is ultimately diagnosing a patient with a rare disease, in this case, mitochondrial disease. You can see the flow through this in terms of different types of specialists needing to be seen. Ultimately, having to find oftentimes a mitochondrial expert is a requirement for many patients with a mitochondrial disease to get a diagnosis. The time to diagnosis that they see on average can extend anywhere from about 10 years plus. The results in the bottom right show you a little bit about this. Those that are receiving a diagnosis can often extend between 10 years on average, but up to 16 and a half years. 16 and a half years with no understanding behind what's causing your signs and symptoms, an idea of anything that would happen in the future in terms of expectations of how your disease might progress, or an idea of, again, if there are any treatments that might be accessible for you. In addition to that, many patients will oftentimes go through many different specialists. On average, nearly 17 specialists seen since first starting to have some type of symptom. Now, again, these are common issues that would lead to interference with getting a diagnosis, as an example. I'm going to focus on two of these: lack of knowledge about the disease, as well as some of the access difficulties. But there's quite a number of different patterns within this. When patients are looking for information similarly, they'll be turning to many different resources, articles that you'll write, medical professionals, online research, social media. We see the same with caregivers as well. They'll turn to definitely doctors and other healthcare professionals, but oftentimes they're not the ones that may know the disease as well because they're so rare. Other advocates, organizations, online support groups, or web pages are where they might be looking for information, as well as the articles that you're going to be writing. When we talk about the patient journey, oftentimes what happens is that individuals will start having symptoms, no explanation for them, go to their primary care physician or general practitioner, and then start their search online. That's oftentimes where they will intersect with some of the programs that I'll describe a little bit of our work with. Again, that might be also where they find your articles as well. The immediate struggle for many patients initially is really figuring out who to see, what specialist, medical specialist they need to go to next to start their diagnostic workup, the types of labs or procedures that they're going to have to do, if they need a genetic test, for example, and getting access to those. This diagnostic odyssey, as I mentioned earlier, it can take years on average. And for many, it can extend well beyond what we would expect, again, decades. So there are a lot of different resources for reliable information online. As an example, here are 5 different web pages that you can find from the National Institutes of Health alone. Part of what we were trying to do in our program, Genetic and Rare Disease Information Center, was to ask, rather than us creating yet another resource, what is it that we can do to help with the issues that patients with rare diseases are seeing? Can we focus on some of their current needs, but also try to repurpose what else is out there in terms of information? So one of the things that we've been focusing on is really a reimagining of our website. It's still in development, so you'll see some of this live, but we're still heavily in the process of thinking about this and thinking about how we can scale this transition. There are a lot of different resources online, as well as community resources and data that is available for rare diseases. Part of the problem is that all this information is in its own silo. One of the things that we're trying to investigate with our approaches are how to start bridging some of the gaps in these different silos and think about what we would need to present to patients. So this program, GARD, again, Genetic and Rare Disease Information Center, its goal is really to provide understandable information about rare diseases to patients, caregivers, and the general public. In the past, this is really focused on a contact center or a call center where we try to provide individualized support. One of the issues we've seen from a public health website stance is that we have 10,000 diseases. We have 2 choices here. We can go in depth on a few, or we can try to be broad about many and think about where we would focus our attention. That's part of what we're trying to understand right now is where we need to go with public health information for rare diseases to really address the challenges within this space. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different knowledge sources. Our colleagues in the EU from Orphanet generate a lot of information on thousands of diseases for clinicians. There's information on genetics for, again, thousands of disorders. There are hundreds of different review articles written for clinicians. And multiple data sets capturing things like signs and symptoms, when a disease might start in terms of its age of onset, and other facets like inheritance. One of the problems is that all of this different type of information that exists, it exists in research databases and data sets, but really hasn't been leveraged for patients. Patient information is oftentimes written in its own format. And again, folks at different agencies like the NIH or FDA and CDC in the US strive to oftentimes create very patient-friendly, plain language information, but this is all separate from all of this other rare disease knowledge. And again, as I noted earlier, patients oftentimes are the best resource for other patients with rare diseases. So they will create resources themselves as well. All these different silos occur in the information space, and that these are challenges that we need to be really thinking about bridging in order to affect many diseases at a time, and ultimately to address an unmet need within the rare diseases space, this diagnostic odyssey that many patients will face. So what we try to do is we're trying to really focus on understanding the patient journey. Oftentimes within websites, we will talk about this as UX or user experience. We're looking at challenges and obstacles that patients are trying to face in their initial online research. When they start their research, they may have already connected with a primary care provider, a general practitioner, or even sought out care within emergency departments. But they're really asking questions about how to get a diagnosis and where to find support. So in our contact center, this is easy to do. We can individually tailor everything we're offering to anyone that calls in, because that person we get to engage with, and we get to really triage and kind of tailor our information to that individual. From a website perspective, this is much more difficult. So again, from a translational science point of view, we need to be thinking about what types of information currently exist. And we need to be thinking about how we can shift that information, accelerate it, and be able to deliver it to patients more rapidly. So that's one of the aims that we're trying to focus on, is really thinking about how to bridge this divide more rapidly. And then second part of this is to then think about how to do this times 10,000 diseases. Again, we can't do this one disease at a time. We have too many disorders that we have to think about. So our focus is not just thinking about bringing that information to patients, writing it in the best way we can, but really, can we apply scalable practices so that we can leverage the information available and advance our understanding of all rare diseases? What does that mean? Well, part of this is thinking about a concept called health literacy. So we want to be able to fit information to patients' and caregivers' perspectives and needs. An example of that, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the major challenges for patients early in their diagnostic odyssey is figuring out who to see. We have data sets of where researchers and clinicians have organized which diseases fit with particular clinical practices. What we're trying to do is leverage those research data sets to say, well, the clinicians already kind of come in and said, hey, this disease is likely to be a genetic disorder. Can't we then think about, for a patient, most likely thing is you need to start understanding what genetics is. You need to start understanding that maybe one of the questions that was going to come to you is about genetic testing, or maybe one of the specialists that you're going to need to likely see is a geneticist. Can we introduce information to help you understand, get some understanding of genetic literacy? What is a gene? What genetic testing involves? What are maybe questions that might prevent a patient from being able to get a genetic test? Access issues, again, that they may need to surmount. Can we start to then unravel that so that when we know any disease that has a potential genetic origin, it's going to be something that likely a patient is going to have to understand? Can we then give that to any of those diseases with that pattern? Again, this is kind of where we're trying to identify and repurpose information that someone has developed for another use. This was developed more for clinical coding. We're trying to think about how we can use that for rules to help us provide information for patients. Another example, again, leveraging user experience, is really thinking about how we tailor this information. We know that certain diseases, we have captured information on when their age of onset is, when you start to see signs and symptoms. Here you see, as an example of that, just a graphical infographic, just demonstrating how we can repurpose some of that information. what I'm showing you are not finished products, or final products, I should say. These are starting points to allow us to start to establish a dialogue with users. In showing you this graphic and saying that a certain disease might begin as you might start to see symptoms when your child is a newborn or an infant. What other information do we need to then bring to you? Do we need to bring you resources for how to be able to understand developmental milestones, so that when you're seeing your child, and if you have a concern that they may have a learning disability, or they may not be progressing in their developmental milestones as rapidly, is there a resource that we can point you to help you see videos for comparison, or images to help you understand that? Again, these are tools that we are using right now to start dialogue with our users, to then understand what else do we have to provide in terms of information. Example of this would be when we show our list of diseases that are rare, how are patients and caregivers searching for that? Do we need certain filter terms? Do you need to see that some diseases are pediatric, or some diseases are related to the eye, or involve a cancer? What are you looking for when you're searching for a disease? These are questions that we're trying to understand right now, so that we can then go back to what data has already been created and see if we can repurpose it for other uses as well. There are many different programs we have that we've been working on. Again, GARD is one example of this. There are a couple other programs that Rachel had mentioned earlier that we have available that are more educational websites. What we're trying to do as a whole is think about how we can involve patients and patient advocates and their families in the research process, both to provide them information to support their journey as patients, but also how we can engage them as active partners. Because again, within the rare disease research space, every patient, every family counts. So I just wanted to end on this. As journalists, you will be giving voice to the stories of rare disease patients and their families. And oftentimes, again, for many of you, you may already have stories that you have in mind of individuals that you've met, or stories of people that you've seen. The key for many is also thinking about direction, in thinking of hope and resilience. Besides just kind of understanding that this is a rare disease or a medical mystery, what can a patient do with that when they've been told that they have this disease? Or how can this help other patients potentially in their diagnostic odyssey looking for solutions? They're going to be coming to your articles trying to see, does that person's story match my story? Do elements of what I'm experiencing and facing, does anyone else also relate to this? And a lot of the opportunity that you're going to have in providing your stories and giving voice to these different patients and families is also giving direction for folks that are often struggling for hope and trying to really build in the resilience. So I just wanted to really encourage you to think about how your articles are going to be used by patients and their families to really think about what they need to do in their lives as well. And last thing I'll do here is just give a plug. Every year we have an event at the NIH called for Rare Disease Day. This is an international event, but at the NIH we try to have a whole day of different talks and panels that will go over on, about updates of the NIH in terms of the work we're doing around rare diseases. More and more we focus on patient stories. So often every year now on our agenda, we will have dedicated patient individuals that are patients or family members talk about their stories, because again, that's really how people are connecting to issues within rare diseases. So I'd encourage you to look up and attend, or see if there are events happening within your area or within your nation regarding Rare Diseases Day. Again, thank you, and I just wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions, so I tried giving a little bit of an overview on everything. Feel free to bring any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I have about 20 questions I want to ask you myself, but we want to defer to our fellows who are very eager and have already started putting questions in the chat. I'd like to ask if fellows would like to join us, or if they want to allow me to read the question. So I'm going to say, Mohammed, Mohammed Mansour is based in Egypt and he writes for Nature. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Would you like to ask your question? Go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Eric, for your presentation. It's a very good presentation, by the way. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one, how do varied definition of rare disease across different countries or medical organizations impact research, diagnosis, and treatment? The other one is, what are the challenges associated with establishing a universal definition for rare disease that accommodate diverse medical conditions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your questions. And I just wanted to echo one comment earlier for Rachel. I know there's a lot of questions, but also I appreciate all of the welcoming for this talk. In terms of the varying definitions of rare diseases across different countries and how that impacts research, diagnosis, and treatment. So the majority of rare diseases are rare enough, they're extremely low in their prevalence rates that everyone will agree they're rare disease. There are very few that are at that higher margin, again, as a whole, collectively. What that does mean, though, is that part of it has to do with, and again, in some ways, the numbers chosen have meaning, but are also arbitrary. They're decided by each country. The issue for them is really thinking about, when you think about a disease, what was rare in one country may be common in another, as an example. Malaria is a good example. In the US, malaria is rare. Throughout much of the world, malaria is not rare. It's a common disorder. But what this means in the US is that there's a lot less research emphasis and focus on diseases like malaria. So one of the things that you want to think about with rare diseases is, again, this ultimately stems back to the definition is one legislative, but also meant to focus on diseases where there's unmet needs and oftentimes lack of investment and opportunity. So even though these may have different definitions across organizations and countries, I think, in general, most people would agree that when you have a disease that affects only like 20 people or 100 people or 1,000 people in the world, those are diseases that are oftentimes getting ignored. So there's a lot of commonality in terms of how we would all approach rare diseases. To your second question, part of the challenge of establishing a common definition, again, is that these are legislative definitions, right? So within the US, there is a, the flip side of this is when there is a drug that is, or a therapeutic that's developed for a rare disease, it can get certain market privileges, what they call orphan designation, orphan drug designation, that allows for exclusive marketing, for example, that you may not want to provide for something like a common disease, because that's the only way you're going to get a pharmaceutical industry to be able to enter the space. It's to say, hey, we're going to give you these different tax breaks and other benefits to basically your investment. So that's, again, a very unique challenge to the US as well as other countries. Each country has their own mechanism in terms of how they regulate both research, but also therapeutic development as a whole. In some ways, the problem with getting a universal definition is the fact that every nation controls and kind of thinks about investment in research as well as therapeutic development the same ways. So again, it's a difficult one because each country has their own approach to approving a drug. We have the FDA in the US, the EU has the EMA as an example, and you have to go through this process with each regulatory agency. So it's a difficulty in terms of the research approach as a whole. This goes back to that one-size-fits-all model.
We'll move now to Julia Matro. She's based here in the US. And then after Julia, we'll hear from Pascalina Kabi, who is based in Lesotho.
Hi, I'm going to speak quietly. I don't know if you can still hear me. I just have roommates and it's not even 6 a.m. where I am. Part of my question is just hearing about the importance of doing science and research across conditions. There's like one thing that I put in my question: what kind of incentives can be given for pharma companies to apply for approval for like more conditions at once? I have a rare type of vasculitis, hypocomplementaric urticarial vasculitis syndrome, to be specific. And I'm thinking about rituximab, which Genentech, when it applied for orphan drug status for 2 types of vasculitis only, despite these conditions arguably working the same. Could there be more incentive to try and get these companies to apply for more if the science is there? Just because, unfortunately, in the US, for off-label uses, it's kind of hard to get companies to, then insurance companies to cover stuff that the FDA, et cetera, didn't give approval for.
It's a great question. And again, it touches back on this one size fits all model, and that we have to face. It's not just the issue of trying to give incentives to industry to apply for drugs, but it's also in the regulatory space, right? We need to be approaching things as groups of disorders, not just one disease at a time, because otherwise we have exactly this type of problem where you see that there's an existing therapy that likely is able to be applied in other rare diseases or subtypes of rare diseases. But currently the approaches we have is to look at it one drug, one disease, and a connection based off of that. And again, it's not a scalable approach. Folks in the FDA have been speaking about that and the need for approaches to really understand how to create these more kind of platform approaches for repurposing of drugs so that we can gain access to this for larger groups of rare diseases as a whole. And similarly, there are a number of different rare diseases that will likely benefit from existing drugs that could be, again, targeted towards them in terms of repurposing. But there's a lot of work that needs to go both in the research space for this, for industry to be involved, also in the regulatory space. So that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity in the coming years. What we saw with COVID was it started to really push people forward in terms of thinking of not just continuing with the current approach to how we both develop and do research on therapeutics, but also how we work with regulators on this as well. So not a perfect answer for you, but again, I think there's definitely a lot of movements occurring in the space.
Pascalina Kabi of Uncensored News in Lesotho will be followed by Rupsa Chakraborty of the Indian Express in India.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sid, for quite an insightful presentation. Clinical trials in Africa, where they are very scarce, and there are many patients, I think, that their diseases go unreported because of lack of clinical trials. What do you suggest needs to be done to ensure that patients of rare diseases in Africa are not left behind, that the train takes along everyone instead of leaving others behind who may even die without a diagnosis? A follow-up to that question still is, in the spirit of practicing responsible journalism, how does one go about telling stories of those rare diseases, particularly on a focus of someone who hasn't been diagnosed? How do we navigate around that to tell stories that this particular person is suffering probably from a rare disease but has not been diagnosed? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the later half of that question, and I'll come back to the first half. So one thing to think about is I would divide someone that's not yet diagnosed with a disease. So there's a known disease, but they haven't gone through, maybe they haven't seen the right specialist, they haven't had the lab done or test or procedure done, they haven't developed the right symptoms yet, maybe the disease hasn't progressed sufficiently yet to be diagnosed, but their disease is known. They just haven't been diagnosed themselves. They're not yet diagnosed. That's a difference versus there are those that have an undiagnosed disease where nobody really understands it. No one's really defined it yet. We don't really, we haven't yet identified the connection between maybe a gene and their symptoms. They may be the first person identified with that if they get the right type of testing. Those are two different scenarios. Again, one is really kind of focusing on diseases that we know versus another is really about diseases we haven't really studied or defined yet. The difficulty there is that oftentimes there are a lot of barriers that prevent individual from having a diagnosis. And again, it could be barriers that just have to do with the timing for them. May take a certain amount of time before their symptoms start to develop, or they start to have a feature that can really be clearly defined for that disease. or it may be other barriers such as access to healthcare. Part of the problem may be that, again, kind of what you were alluding to earlier is maybe there are certain findings like skin findings that there's just less understanding of within different skin of different pigmentation. So those that have darker pigmentation, maybe there's not enough in the medical literature about how that would represent and be seen, so that already for a disease that may be pretty rare, may be harder to define and kind of diagnose, because individuals of darker pigmentation may not have basically been captured in the medical literature yet with that, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of equity issues that can kind of come in here that go back to what you're speaking about in terms of participants in trials for rare disease. If you don't capture that in the evidence space, we may not be aware that there are differences seen by different patients, or again, how the disease might be expressed might be different amongst different individuals. So trying to have individuals of diverse backgrounds captured in rare disease clinical trials is a problem in the US, in addition to internationally. It's not something that oftentimes is asked about. Like one of the questions I had coming in as a when I started entering the space was, what information do we even have in the US that defines if certain rare diseases have been collecting information by race ethnicity, as an example. And I found very little on that. I'm still trying to figure out ways that we can collect this better at scale. So again, I'm sorry for not having a great answer to your question, but it is an issue that is seen not just in Africa, it's an issue seen in the US and EU and other nations as well. Part of our issue here is really trying to understand how do we promote research as a whole and make sure that particular diseases, again, as an example, if there's a higher population within Africa that have it, are we then both representing that in the US, but also in Africa as well? So many rare diseases are international by definition because they're so rare. So you can't find all the patients in one country. This is why a lot of work in rare diseases research is regarding networks and kind of consortia and collaborations, because otherwise, again, like the example I was using earlier, if there's only 25 people in the world with this, every patient, every family will count. So at least in the rare disease space, there's an understanding that international collaboration is highly required. Now, whether or not individual diseases, there is both interest in it as well as a means, they have the funding and opportunity for it. That's the difficulty. That's the crux of the problem that you're getting to.
Rupsa will be followed by Nadima Umar Uthman of GH1 TV in Ghana. Rupsa?
Hi, Dr. Eric. First of all, I want to say that I have gone through all the website, and I must say that the website is really versatile, and it gives so much knowledge about the diseases. It has animation-based information, symptoms, and where people can approach for clinical trials. So in a country like India, developing country, we really lack such kind of infrastructure. Patients are completely lost. And when we talk about research, clinical trial, the main problem in India is that they don't, patient, first of all, they don't get diagnosed.
Yeah.
So as you have years of experience and you are already working with different experts across the globe, so what do you think that where we are actually lacking behind? Are we still not taking the rare disease as seriously as we should be, like the Western countries? And are we giving, like the Indian or the Asian countries are giving adequate amount of incentives to the pharma companies to invest more in such kind of clinical trials, to give medicines or to provide manufactured medicines for this kind of patients? So where the developing countries are actually lacking behind, when we have such kind of example, like as the website, we like, I was really surprised, and I have already shared the link to other patient group and parents, and they didn't know that the system can be so systematic, that they can easily approach the patient group and approach the clinical trial. So if you can give your insight where we are lagging behind and how we can improve it.
Yeah, So I think the first, going back to kind of your concerns about like both diagnosis, and then I'll get back to the clinical trial part. I think the first and foremost thing has to do with having specialists that really understand certain systems well. So the difficulty in rare diseases is that you're talking about disorders that are not very well understood. So first and foremost, who we connect a patient to once they've seen a general practitioner is really important. Is you need individuals that at least understand that space, neurology, or again, like if it's seizures, epileptology, we being able to have the individuals around that you can turn somebody to. So at the very least, there's access. The other difficulty is once you've gotten to specialists, it's still not sufficient because, again, oftentimes these diseases may have very unique expressions. So there may be only a few that have expertise in the world in that disease. So again, there's layers to this. The difficulty in much of the world is the lack of sufficient medical professionals that have an understanding in a particular disease sphere, let alone experts. You're not going to have experts everywhere because, again, the nature of rare diseases is they're rare. So experts will only develop where they can find patients to both basically support and care for, but also to perform research and understand those diseases. So starting with that layer is incredibly important. Oftentimes what our contact center really focuses on, for example, with India, but other countries as well, is trying to look for patient organizations that can act as a bridge because there may not be a government agency that really helps facilitate this. To your point about clinical trials, there are some that will recruit internationally, but again, oftentimes with rare diseases, it's even finding investment in being able to get research occurring for them is a difficulty. So it's an ongoing struggle for many, I think, and part of again, it kind of goes back to the answer I was trying to provide earlier, which is that across the world, it's really understanding collaboration in research is important. And if individual countries start seeing large populations affected, again, in rare disease, large can be contextual, right? That can be 2 people, that can be 10 people, that can be 100 people. But being able to work with other agencies and other groups in the space is really important. We have to be thinking about networks when we talk about these different diseases. Otherwise, you won't see any development work occur. You can't do it in a silo.
We'll take 2 more questions, one from Nadima, and then the final one will be from Swaroop Acharya of the Kantapur Daily in Nepal. Nadima.
Hi, hello everyone. The data you shared sort of had a global perspective. I'm wondering whether there's specific data for persons with rare diseases in Africa, because in Ghana, data is such a challenge when it comes to rare diseases. And sometimes you want to write or tell stories of persons with rare diseases and you search online and you don't really get that much information that you need. Most of the information from the Western country. Also, in your presentation, you mentioned that the rate of discovery and approved drugs is continuing to widen, and in Ghana, it's even worse. How, especially because rare diseases are also competing with other conditions that relevant stakeholders feel are more urgent to tackle, largely due to the issues of funding, and so priority has to be given to specific conditions. What should developing countries like Ghana be doing for a more inclusive access to healthcare?
Yeah, again, it's a tough question to answer in a short amount of time. I'll give the example of, this is something we're seeing in the US that I think as an equity issue, again, is going to extend throughout the rest of the world. We talk about gene therapies. When we talk about both access to them, we're not just talking about having a gene therapy available for a disease. So take something like sickle cell, which is more prevalent within African countries. The difficulties we need in the US already, we still have to develop the infrastructure to both manufacture gene therapies, let alone perform research on that, to make them accessible in a clinic. And then we still have a lot to do in order to enable gene therapies to be equitably accessible to all patients, regardless of, for example, income or background or location, if they're in a rural area or in a more urban area. Now amplify this times other countries where they already may have lacking resources in terms of either specialists, as I alluded to earlier, or medical technologies. Is there access to be able to support use of genetic of gene editing or gene therapies in local areas within some countries, again, as an example. That's going to be an ongoing issue. As we continue to create solutions for more rare diseases that are more gene-based, again, access throughout the rest of the world is going to be an ongoing challenge. We need to be able to develop the infrastructure for them before we can even gain access to them. So there's a lot that's going to be required to be able to do that.
Well, Roop says he got his answer already from your responses. So we're going to end with a question from Thomas Murithi from Talk Africa in Kenya. Thomas.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Sid, for the factual insights. My question is, for a patient with a rare disease, and they also have some other diseases that are not rare, what is the best way to approach telling their story? One with a rare disease, but also they have some other disease, maybe like diabetes or something.
Yeah, and I'll note that, you know, rare diseases don't happen in isolation. You can have multiple rare diseases. You can have rare diseases plus a common disease, as you're alluding to with diabetes. I think a lot of this goes back to the story you're trying to write and the narrative that you're trying to present. Chronic disease care is an issue that extends for both common disorders and rare disorders. The difficulties that you might see with a rare disease is that it might make it even harder to manage that diabetes, right? So what you could be thinking about is how the complexities of having a rare disease may make some issues that, again, a patient maybe with diabetes normally can manage have a lot more difficulty in terms of either access or obstacles they might face because of their rare disease. That might be an angle that you can be able to relate to.
Dr. Sid, you have given us an incredibly dynamic and comprehensive foundation for us to begin this 5-day journey on covering rare disease. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Eric Sid of the Genetic and Rare Diseases Information Center of the NIH for joining us. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you all.